Breathe in. The Atlantic is slate and silver under a low sky, and somewhere beyond the horizon a bell rings on a rolling deck. In harbors from Boston to Charleston, masts draw black lines against dawn. In a half-finished capital of broad avenues and muddy boots, quills scratch over parchment. The air is full of small sounds that signal larger things, signals that, together, will become a war. Begin with the water, because that's where the pressure lives. Britain is fighting for its life against Napoleon and refuses to lift the blockade that starves France. To keep its fleets crewed, the Royal Navy reaches deep, boarding neutral vessels, impressing sailors it calls British, ignoring papers that say otherwise. On grey mornings off the Capes, a sleek frigate will fire a warning shot and swing close. A boarding party will count heads, read names, and take men who speak with New England vowels and Chesapeake tides in their voices. Their names vanish into ship's books. Anger doesn't vanish with them, it lingers. June 22nd, 1807, draws that anger into a single hard picture. HMS Leopard hails USS Chesapeake off the Virginia Capes. The American captain refuses a search. The British reply with broadsides. 3 salvos. Splinters fly. Bodies fall. 4 sailors are dragged away. The United States answers first with laws, not guns, an embargo that locks its own ships in port, then a tangle of replacements meant to punish Europe and protect American pride. Non-intercourse, then Macon's bull number. 2. Commerce staggers. The ocean does not care. British orders in council force neutrals into British ports. Napoleon's decrees promise retaliation. American merchants keep 2 sets of maps in their heads, one for wind and current, another for politics that change with the tide. Turn inland. Beyond the Appalachians, surveyor chains click. Cabins bloom along rivers the treaties said would remain quiet. After Greenville, 1795, after Stanwix, 1768, lines were drawn. Settlement slides across them like water over a weir. Along the Wabash and the Maumee, in the rich ground of the old Northwest, 2 brothers shape a different answer. Tecumseh, tall and fierce-eyed, walks the rivers calling for a confederacy. Shawnee, Delaware, Miami, Pottawatomie, Kickapoo, nations standing together to say that land is shared, not sold. Tenskwatawa, the prophet, builds a village at the confluence of the Tippecanoe and Wabash. Prophetstown, preaching renewal, discipline, the old ways rekindled. Trade goods and quiet promises cross from British posts in Upper Canada. Rumors, louder than facts, cross back. In Washington City, white walls new against the red clay. Politics sharpen. A generation who grew up on stories of 76 feels the sting of searched decks as a fresh humiliation. In the House, voices rise from the West and South, the war hawks, arguing honor, security, and a chance to unmake British influence on the frontier. Henry Clay of Kentucky with a speaker's thunder. John C. Calhoun of South Carolina with a lawyer's blade. They speak boldly of Canada, lightly garrisoned and held by a Britain distracted by Europe. From New England, ledger keepers push back. War means blockade and ruin. Pride will not pay wharf fees. North and South, coast and interior, begin to feel like terms rather than merely directions. Autumn 1811 tightens the coil. Territory Governor William Henry Harrison marches up the Wabash to talk at Prophetstown with a mixed column, regulars, militia, scouts, and in the cold pre-dawn of November 7th, rifles crack through fog at Tippecanoe. The fight is close, smoky, confusing. Fires lighting faces, volleys at yards. By noon, Prophetstown is scattered. Harrison writes victory. Tecumseh returns to embers and swears the next battle will not be a skirmish. In Detroit, at Fort Malden, in Amherstburg, British officers take note. If war comes, this alliance can turn a threadbare defense into a living wall. Set the pieces on the northern board. The American regular army on paper is barely 10,000. In reality, fewer are fit, fewer drilled. Officers include grey veterans and green ambitions. Militia numbers look grand in speeches and thin on freezing picket lines. The Navy is a handful of thoroughbreds, heavy frigates, Constitution, United States, President, stoutly built, long-gunned, sailed by crews who know how to reef, reload, and win. The foe at sea is enormous, the Royal Navy, honed by a generation of blockade. But Britain's gaze is fixed on Napoleon. Its North American garrisons are small. Sir George Prevost governs from Quebec with prudence and a tight hand on powder. On the Niagara and Detroit frontiers, one commander moves like a spark. Major General Isaac Brock, restless, decisive, teaching militia to think like regulars. Trace the frontier line with your finger. Detroit faces Amherstburg across a narrow strait where river weeds brush keels. Farther north, an island fort at Mackinac controls the upper lakes like a cork in a bottle. Along the Niagara, Fort Niagara and Fort George glare at each other across rapids. Queenston Heights rises like a knuckle above the river. Lewiston and Schlosser stand by their landings. Kingston at the mouth of the Saint. Lawrence is a knot of stone and guns. Opposite, a quiet settlement called Sackett's Harbor will, very soon, become a shipyard where trees turn into warships at astonishing speed. To the east, the Richelieu Corridor points down toward Lake Champlain and the door to Montreal. Every waterway is a road, every road a risk. Across the salt water, something shifts too late. British manufacturers, punished by the loss of American trade, press their cabinet to relent. On June the 23rd, 1812, London suspends the orders in council that have strangled neutral shipping. The message must cross an ocean by sail. In Washington, President James Madison has already sent his own message. June 1st, a careful ledger of grievances, impressment, seizures, blockades without right, frontier incitement. Debate burns hot, region by region. On June 18th, the tallies are called 79 to 49 in the House, 19 to 13 in the Senate. The United States declares war. 5 days later, a British policy that sparked so much of it is cancelled. Wind and distance laugh at timing. Feel the human scale of the moment. A boatswain's pipe shrills on a frigate's dawn watch. Gun crews polish brass that will soon be hot to the touch. At a lakeside clearing, axes bite green timber, and a keel is laid where yesterday there were only trees and loons. In Upper Canada, Brock drills militia on wet grass and thumbs a map that shows more river than road. In a maple grove above the Thames, Tecumseh tells a circle of warriors that a single arrow breaks, a bundle does not. In a brick office on a muddy Washington street, a clerk dusts sand over wet signatures, commissions, requisitions, orders for powder, flint, pork, salt, boats, nails. The first moves will be quiet and sharp, oars dipping toward Mackinac before sunrise. An American general misreading a ledger and surrendering a whole town without a shot. A climb up a cliff at Queenston where a name, Brock, will become a legend in both grief and pride. For tonight, just listen to the setup. Charts folded and stacked, lanterns hooded, courier horses breathing in their nosebags. Canvas, cannon, and glory are all still waiting in the dark. When the wind turns, the lakes and the ocean will speak at once, and the year will answer. Night thins over the inland seas, and the first moves come quiet, like oars slipping into black water. Far to the north, at the straits, a British detachment and fur trade voyageurs push through mist toward a hilltop palisade, Fort Mackinac, before sunrise. A single gun, a white flag, a measured demand. The startled American garrison, ignorant that war has been declared, yields without a shot. The upper lakes belong to the Redcoats, and their Anishinaabe and Odawa allies. Before most people along the frontier even know a treaty has torn, ripples spread fast. On the Detroit River, General William Hull steps across into Upper Canada with a paper-thin army of regulars and Ohio militia, promising liberation to neighbors who hear it as invasion. He posts proclamations in Sandwich, then hears drums behind him. British regulars and Canadian militia gather at Fort Malden, and with them Tecumseh's warriors, bows strung, rifles clean, eyes set. Hull hesitates, glances over his shoulder at supply wagons still somewhere on the Wilderness Road, and folds back over the river. Confidence runs down like a watch that needs winding. August opens like a trap. Brock, all energy and daring, gallops west with a handful of companies, turns militia into a line, and in a single day rewrites the odds with nerve. He marches straight to Detroit's gate, drapes the woods with Tecumseh's men so their numbers look endless, and rolls a field piece up Madison Avenue within easy view. A note goes in. Surrender now, and spare the town from storm. Hull sees phantoms, indigenous war cries echoing against brick, the memory of Mackinac, the uneasy militia at his elbows, and lowers the flag. Detroit, a whole territorial army, guns, magazines, records, and pride pass into British hands in an afternoon. News gallops like a herald. The frontier bends red. The governor of Canada has a victory worth a season. Southwest at the Chicago River, another small drama turns to ash. The tiny garrison at Fort Dearborn accepts terms to evacuate east under escort. On the sandy road along the lake, a coalition of local warriors and enraged factions fall upon the column. Smoke rises over the dunes. The fort is burned, and the map of the old Northwest fills with whispers that doors once thought safe are now simply wood. The Niagara frontier tightens like a rope. Batteries stare at each other across water spun white. Americans gather at Lewiston and Schlosser. British and Canadians dig at Queenston and atop the limestone scarp beyond. October 13th, before dawn, muffled oars bite the river, and American regulars and volunteers claw onto the stony foot of the heights. Grappling hooks catch, boots find holds. A handful of men crest the escarpment under the nose of a gun that cannot be depressed low enough to stop them. For an hour, astonishment becomes advantage. Then Brock, all impulse and impatience, gallops to the sound of firing, throws himself at the intruders, and falls with a musket ball in his coat. The line sags, then stiffens under his subordinates. Across the river, New York militia refuse to cross. No foreign service. Their officers waving hats and legal opinions that won't carry a single bayonet uphill. On the heights, isolated troops fight hard and look back over a torrent they cannot recross. By dusk, the cliffside victory is a cliffside surrender. The river runs on. Both banks learn the same lesson. Courage without connection is just noise. At sea, the music changes key. A small navy with outsize hulls meets a giant fleet in the only way it can, ship to ship, captain to captain. August 19th, northeast of Boston, heavy timbers and long guns write a scene that will be painted for a century. USS Constitution meets HMS Guerriere in rough seas. American round shot smashes, British spars tumble, and Live Oak seems to shrug off iron. The nickname Old Ironsides takes root with every cheer that carries across grey swells. October, a brace of victories. USS Wasp batters HMS Frolic in a rainstorm. Then both are snapped up by a British 74 like minnows by a pike. USS United States under Stephen Decatur methodically pounds HMS Macedonian into submission and sails the prize into a delirious New York. In December, Constitution again, this time against HMS Java, fights closes, and maims her opponent beyond towing. Each combat is small in global arithmetic. Each one is thunder to a young republic, measuring itself by headlines and harbor crowds. Privateers, too, slip from Salem, Baltimore, New York, sleek schooners with brave crews, harrying British commerce, sending insurance rates upward and reminders outward that a nation can be stubborn even when small. On the lakes, shipyards sprout like mushrooms after rain. At Sackett's Harbour, on Lake Ontario, hammers ring day and night. Trees fall in the morning and become frames by afternoon. Commodore Isaac Chauncey arrives with a yard's eye and gathers shipwrights the way a general gathers regiments. Across at Kingston, British builders answer in kind. The inland arms race has begun. Ropes spliced out of farm hemp, anchors cast in cold iron, cannon dragged over winter roads, entire warships birthed out of forests and urgency. Before ice forms, Chauncey chases HMS Royal George into Kingston Harbour, trading round shot with shore batteries and learning the feel of this private sea war, windward, shoal, and the exact depth of courage that keeps a ship in just a moment longer. On the far frontier, the surrender at Detroit does not end the Western struggle. It hardens it. Tecumseh's Confederacy is stronger than rumor now. Real, disciplined, more than a war party and less than an army. Which is exactly what this ground demands. American leadership changes hands. William Henry Harrison is back, not as territorial governor, but as general, raising the Army of the Northwest. Raw levies, a few regulars, long supply lines, tasked with recovering what a signature lost. Forts are thrown up and provisioned at Piqua, Defiance, Upper Sandusky. Roads are cut through black swamp and maple stands. Barrels of salt pork and kegs of powder crawl forward like beads along a string that can be cut in a night. The Saint. Lawrence Corridor watches and waits. An American thrust toward Montreal is talked into being, and then talked down by logistics, militia terms expiring, sleighs not yet running, rivers too low and then too fast. Generals arguing over seniority while Snow answers without prejudice. Sir George Prevost, prudent as a banker, holds his lines, writes for more powder, and treats time itself as a fortress. In the Chesapeake and off New York, blue horizons begin to bristle with tall masts wearing the Union flag. The blockade grows from rumor to routine. Ships of the line pacing outside capes, frigates ghosting along inlets, cutters darting toward any sail that looks like profit. Coasters cuddle the shoreline. Pilots learn new channels. Warehouses in New England count the cost on cold fingers and curse a war declared by distant votes. In taverns from Boston to New Haven, toasts tilt toward peace. In Kentucky and Tennessee, toasts tilt toward honor. November brings an answer to that argument from the ballot box. Madison, cautious and steady, wins re-election narrowly over DeWitt Clinton. The war becomes not only a policy, but a mandate. thin, contested, and still enough. Winter lays its hand on the map. Lakes harden, batteries cool. The Niagara quiets to the sound of ice grinding along the rapids. In Sackett's Harbour and Kingston, shipwrights work under lanterns in air that turns breath to smoke. On the Mormie and the Sandusky, teamsters curse rutted roads and count the miles to the next depot. In the shadow of Fort Malden, British officers balance ledgers of cartridges and hardtack against distances and alliances. In Longhouse council fires and village lodges, winter councils weigh the cost of another season of war. Listen to the small sounds that foreshadow what comes next. Adzes biting into keelsons for 2 brigs that will decide a whole lake. A quartermaster penciling Erie on a bill of lading no one has ever written before. A colonel in red reading a letter from York, Toronto, about supplies that cannot move before thaw. A governor in Montreal worrying more about flour than flags. The first year has taught both sides how quickly spectacle can turn to smoke, how much courage costs when roads fail, how a single captain on a single riverbank can tilt a whole theatre with a good bluff and a straight back. When the ice breaks, the war will change shape. Fleets built in the months of silence will slide into blue water, on Ontario as equals, on Erie as contestants. A young shipmaster named Oliver Hazard Perry will be handed green crews in a harbour choked with timbers and turn them into a sentence. History will repeat. Armies will move again. A capital on a cold lake will be surprised by dawn sails. A fort on the Niagara will trade flags under a bombardment that shakes glass a day's march away. Tecumseh will stride across a low river in autumn with resolve that tightens hearts on both sides. For now, let the snow soften everything. The next chapter starts with thaw, canvas half frozen in the rigging, and the first gulls wheeling over new-built decks. Thaw comes with the sound of adzes, gulls, and ropes creaking over new paint. On Lake Ontario, the shipyards wake first. At Sackett's Harbour, Chauncey's carpenters turn forest into frigates. At Kingston, Sir James Yeo arrives to answer in kind. The inland sea becomes a chessboard of spars and soundings, short sorties, sudden chases, both admirals nursing half-built hulls, and crews learning to fight in waters where shoals sit just under the blue. Neither side risks a crippling blow. Both raid where the other is thin. Dawn sails slide out of the fog on April 27th. American troops cross to a low shoreline dotted with stumps and new streets. York, capital of Upper Canada. Guns trade thunder. A ship under construction burns. Public buildings catch and go up with them. The Americans lift off by afternoon, leaving smoke and a bitterness that will grow teeth before winter. A month later, the blow falls harder at the river's mouth. May 27th. Batteries along the Niagara open from boats. Fort George staggers under hot shot and retreats inland. The American flag goes up on the heights. The British column falls back toward Burlington Bay, lean and angry. The recoil comes at night, June 6th, Stony Creek, a cold, quiet strike through tents and watchfires. The British bayonet. The map back into shape. American command snatched, lines confused. The advance stalled. 3 weeks later, June 24th, the woods speak. A warning carried over dark roads guides small regulars and many warriors to Beaver Dams. American skirmishers find themselves surrounded by echoes and trees. A garrison surrenders to a force that used the land as a weapon. By midsummer, the Niagara front is a taut wire. Fort George held, but the inland roads contested inch by inch. Farther west, the Maumee and Sandusky hear their own thunder. In May, British guns and Tecumseh's warriors ring Fort Meigs. Sorties flare. A riverbank runs with confusion, and then the siege lifts. Supplies short, ground flooded, timing off. August brings a second attempt on the line at Fort Stephenson. A young commander, George Croghan, parks a single field piece so that its canister scours the approach. A compact assault breaks apart on a small fort that refuses to waste powder. These checks do not end the contest. They keep the line breathing until the lake decides. That lake is Erie, and Erie is a shipyard in a hurry. Through spring and summer at Presque Isle, men sleep on deck planks still warm from the sun. Timber becomes 2 brigs and a squadron under a 28-year-old captain with a sharp eye and a gift for order, Oliver Hazard Perry. He drills green crews hard and flat, shifts long guns to make up for weight, and watches sandbars like enemies. In early September, the British squadron under Robert Barclay, short of provisions, compelled by necessity, puts out from Amherstburg. Perry slides from the harbour, threads the bar, and draws up his line under a flag stitched with a dying friend's words. September the 10th, 1813. The lake is a sheet of hammered steel. Lawrence takes the brunt, yardarm to yardarm, until her guns fall silent and decks are a maze of wreck and rope. Perry lowers his battle flag, steps into a boat, and rows to Niagara through a hail of shot that cannot quite find him. He breaks the line under full sail, rakes the British ships fore and aft, and in minutes the geometry changes. When it ends, the enemy squadron strikes colors, and a brief sentence crosses American dispatches like a lantern. We have met the enemy, and they are ours. The words are spare. The effect is vast. The water road to Detroit belongs to the United States. Harrison moves the moment the lake tells him he can. Detroit is reoccupied without a fight. The Army of the Northwest rides east along the Thames in Upper Canada, pressing a British column that cannot outpace empty magazines. October the 5th, 1813. The battle opens and closes fast, on ground broken by river bends and swamp. British regulars give way first. The Confederacy holds longest. In the rush and smoke, Tecumseh falls. What he built does not disappear at a stroke, but its center is gone. The alliance frays into local fights and winter councils. For the first time since June of the previous year, the Western theater tilts decisively and stays there. Back east, the St. Lawrence corridor tries to move and learns again how stubborn distance is. An American army under Wade Hampton comes down the Chateauguay River, meets a slim Canadian Mohawk screen under the Salaberry, and finds its columns tangled in abatis and echoing shouts. The attack ebbs, then dies. Farther downriver, Jacob Brown's and James Wilkinson's push toward Montreal dissolves in argument and scale. November 11th, at Chrysler's Farm, a smaller British-Canadian force steadies under fire, trades well-aimed volleys, and sends a larger American army back up the bank in pieces. The river keeps its secret for another year. Lake Ontario closes the season with a flurry. In late May, while the Niagara is ablaze, Yeo strikes at Sackett's Harbour itself. Militia break, regulars stiffen. The Navy Yard is nearly lost before desperate defenders pull it back at the edge of chaos. Through summer and into fall, the two fleets circle, spar, and count hulls on the stocks. Neither admiral offers the decisive risk. Raids replace battles. Shore parties spike guns, burn storehouses, and vanish seaward before cavalry can appear at the dunes. The Chesapeake feels a different war, low, persistent, and unnerving. In 1813, the blockade hardens to fact. British tenders nose up creeks, seize coasters, and skirmish with watermen who know every shoal by touch. Norfolk's outer defences hold at Craney Island in June. Elsewhere, villages learn to douse hearths at the first look of sails. Tangier Island becomes a British base. Promises of freedom for enslaved labourers begin to move people as surely as muskets do. The coast leans into endurance. Then winter scrapes its verdict across the Niagara. In December, after months of skirmishes and retreats, an American commander burns the small town of Newark, Niagara-on-the-Lake, to deny British winter quarters. Civilians stumble into snow and wind. Retaliation is swift and cold. British and Allied warriors cross back, take Fort Niagara before dawn, and roll south along the river. Black Rock and Buffalo burn under an iron-grey sky. The frontier spends the last days of the year counting chimneys and gathering anyone left into barns that still have roofs. Pause over the map. The West has flipped. Lake Erie is American. Detroit holds. The Thames campaign has closed a long wound. Ontario is an arms race still in motion. Neither side has dared its whole fortune there. The Saint. Lawrence stands, guarded by small, disciplined forces that know the ground better than any paper plan. the seaboard sits under a blockade that bleeds ports in silence and trains militia to listen for oars at night. And in cabins from Vermont to the Tennessee, in longhouses on the Grand and the Thames, in garrisons along the Richelieu, winter work begins again, fixing wheels, patching sails, writing lists for iron, salt, and powder. Hear the prelude to spring, adzes ringing at Kingston and Sackett's Harbour for bigger ships yet. Perry's emptied lake now feeding Harrison's supply tables. A young brigadier on the Niagara, Winfield Scott, drilling dusty ranks bright, turning militia into something closer to a regular line. British logistics shifting to rebuild the Niagara post by post. Councils in Quebec and Washington sketching 1814 with thicker pencils. Next come heavy frigates lashed together on fresh water. A capital on a tidal river tested by fire. And a northern lake where a single morning will decide the whole year's last equation. For now, the ice takes the edges off everything, and breath steadies in the cold. The year that began with oars in darkness has taught both sides how to move. The next will ask who can hold. Ice loosens its grip on the lakes, and the year wakes to the sound of planed timber and cadence calls. Along the Niagara frontier, tents bloom in wet fields, while a young brigadier named Winfield Scott turns raw battalions into a line that can move and fire like a single thought. Uniform cloth is scarce. His brigade drills in grey jackets cut to one standard, muskets kept bright, knapsacks packed the same way. Commands are crisp, French manuals translated into steps that any farmer can learn by repetition. Farther back, quartermasters tug supply forward, flour, pork, ball, flint, counted into wagons that have to survive the same miles as the men. Across the river, British posts mend what winter and last year's fires broke. At Fort George and along the back roads to Burlington Heights, pickets listen for oars at night. Since York burned, Upper Canada keeps one eye on the shoreline and another on the inland roads. The loss of Detroit still stings, but the winter's retaliation at Fort Niagara and Buffalo has evened ledgers in hard coin. Reinforcements from Europe begin to trickle across the Atlantic now that Napoleon has fallen. Companies with fresh kit, officers with new orders. The first stroke is clean and quick. July 3rd, 1814. American boats push across the Niagara and take Fort Erie before breakfast. Guns spiked, garrison paroled, a foothold established. The column under Major General Jacob Brown moves north along the river road, Scott's grey-clad brigade in the van, and meets a British force under Phineas Reel on open ground striped by the Chippewa River. July 5th, the two lines dress opposite each other in a wide meadow. Smoke drifts low. Artillery speaks in measured beats. And then the infantry come on with bayonets fixed. Reel thinks he faces militia. The grey coats hold and pour volley after volley at 50 paces. The British line wavers, then yields. For the first time in the war, a trained American line wins a stand-up, open-field fight against British regulars. The road to Queenston seems open. Supply and sea decide otherwise. On Lake Ontario, Sir James Yeo raids at Oswego in May, seizing naval stores the Americans badly need. He then watches Kingston's yards raise a floating citadel, plank by plank. Commodore Isaac Chauncey at Sackett's Harbour answers with his own launches and brigs, but will not hazard them without advantage. The lake becomes a chessboard of watchful hulls, with Yeo free to appear off the Niagara mouth at a day's notice. Brown's wagons cannot move safely along the lake shore, and his column must live off the thin, contested road that rides the riverbank hedges. Every biscuit becomes a plan. July 25th, at day's end, the plans meet twilight on a low ridge near a cataract's mist, Lundy's Lane. The British, now under Gordon Drummond, anchor guns atop a rise overlooking the road. The Americans, coming up from Queenston, see the muzzles flare against the dim. The battle begins in half-light and continues into darkness. Batteries taken and retaken, flags briefly traded, regiments fighting by the sound of each other's voices. Scott is wounded, Brown too. Drummond is hit. Reinforcements drip into both lines by companies, not brigades. When midnight comes, neither army has the strength to throw the other off the hill. At dawn, the Americans choose to fall back to Fort Erie to dress their wounds and draw supply. The British claim the field, but not the decision. It is the kind of fight that leaves maps unchanged and memoirs heavy. The siege at Fort Erie that follows is a long breath held. Drummond invests the post from the north and east. American engineers deepen ditches and lay a web of abattis. Mortars trade lobbing arcs with the fort's guns. August 15th, the British try the walls by storm. Columns in the wet dark, feeling for sally ports and ladders. One bastion explodes after attackers gain its parapet. Another attack is thrown down by grape shot at yards. The ditch fills with smoke and shouts, and then empties again into the night. In September, the garrison turns outward and smashes the siege batteries in a violent sortie that leaves gun positions splintered and the British line shaking. Autumn rain sets in. By October, with sickness and supply grinding the arithmetic down to bone, Drummond slips away. In November, the Americans blow Fort Erie's works and cross back, the season spent. On Lake Ontario, the naval race reaches a lopsided conclusion. All summer, hammers at Kingston have rung for one purpose: a first-rate ship of the line on fresh water. In September, HMS St. Lawrence slides into the lake, a towering wall of oak and guns that neither Chauncey nor his shipwrights can match before ice. Yeo, holding command by mere presence, is content to keep the American squadron in port. No captain wants to test long guns against a ship that can choose range and weather. The lakefront shifts from battle to denial. The outcome there will be measured by what was prevented, not what was won. The war changes key on the salt water. With Napoleon in exile, Britain sends a seasoned expedition to the Chesapeake. Admiral Alexander Cochrane with ships, Major General Robert Ross with light troops who have fought across the peninsula, Rear Admiral George Cockburn, already notorious along the waterways of Virginia and Maryland for swift raids, now has weight behind his scouting. Through summer, the blockade hardens. A shallow draft British flotilla needles creeks and rivers, and enslaved men slip to British tenders in exchange for uniforms and muskets. Joshua Barney's little American gunboat flotilla, trapped in the Patuxent, is scuttled to keep it from capture. The road inland lies open. August the 24th, 1814, the two sides meet at Bladensburg on the Anacostia. A hot day, a hurried line. U.S. regulars and Marines stand on one axis, militia on others. Orders are confused. Ross brings his veterans straight through the center under rocket fire, steadies under grape, and pushes. The American line breaks in pieces, an hour burned into memory as the Bladensburg races. Washington City lies behind, with more public buildings than defenders. That night and into the next day, disciplined British parties fire the Capitol, the President's house, and executive offices. Public structures only, private homes largely spared by order. Dolly Madison's servants carry off a certain portrait before the red glow reaches it. A violent thunderstorm shoulders through the city as flames climb. Lightning, wind, maybe a tornado. Nature adding its own punctuation to a night that will live in the national imagination as both humiliation and survival. Baltimore answers differently. The city is wealthier, warier, and wired for defense. Earthworks thrown up on Hampstead Hill, militia brigades assigned sectors, gun batteries plotted to cover approaches. September the 12th, Ross lands at North Point to march overland while Cochrane's fleet feels its way up the Patapsco. Skirmishers tangle along a sandy road bordered by woods. Ross, far forward as always, is mortally hit by militia marksmen, and command passes to Colonel Arthur Brooke. The march continues but slows. The next day and night, the fleet hurls bombs and rockets at Fort McHenry, whose star-shaped parapets guard the channel. The bombardment is spectacular and mostly ineffective. Major George Armistead's garrison holds under heavy shells whose fuses burn in arcs that can be watched and counted. In the pre-dawn hours, a large boat column tries the shallow flank. Obstructions and crossfire turn it back. At daylight, storm flags come down and a huge garrison flag goes up on the fort's staff, an answer in cloth to a night of flashes. In a truce boat downriver, a detained lawyer named Francis Scott Key measures each burst and writes lines that will outlive the war. Brooke, seeing entrenchments bristling on the hills and the harbour still closed, withdraws. Baltimore remains American. The Chesapeake expedition has made a brutal point at Washington and then met its limit. North, On a different water road, the year's hinge turns. Britain sends its main Canadian army down the Richelieu-Chambly-Lake Champlain corridor toward Plattsburgh and the headwaters of the Hudson. Sir George Prevost in person, with veterans just released from Europe. The plan is simple. Break the American line, anchor winter quarters in New York, and carry leverage to the peace table already set in the Flemish city of Ghent. On the lake, Captain George Downey brings a new ship, HMS Confiance, to join a squadron built in haste. On the American side, Master Commandant Thomas MacDonough has been building quietly at Vergennes. Block and tackle brigs and sloops dragged downriver, anchors and kedges set with care, springs on cables rigged so that ships can be swung to bring fresh broadsides to bear. September 11th, 1814. The wind is fitful on Plattsburgh Bay. Prevost's columns probe the riverside defences, while Downey drives straight at MacDonough's anchored line. The opening broadsides are terrible at pistol-shot range. Confiance's heavy carronades tear holes. But MacDonough has planned for a long minute. When his flagship Saratoga's guns on one side are wrecked, he has the crew haul on springs and anchors to spin the ship in place, presenting an untouched battery to a battered opponent. Across the line, American gunners work low and slow. British gunners, dragged by tide and wind, cannot settle their fire. Downey is killed. One by one, British colours come down. On the shore, Prevost hears that the lake is lost and halts his advance. Without control of the water, his supply wagons are trapped by distance and bridges. The army turns back to Canada in good order, but without its objective. The strategic calculus changes in an hour. That hour travels fast to Europe. In Ghent, American commissioners Adams, Bayard, Clay, Gallatin have been meeting British counterparts through summer and early autumn. London's first proposals had leaned on American setbacks, a neutral indigenous buffer state in the Old Northwest, new boundaries drawn on the lakes, control of rivers to the sea. Baltimore's survival and Plattsburgh's defeat of a main army melt those ambitions. Britain has a global empire to refit and little appetite for an endless forest war. The talks shift toward status quo antebellum. No territory exchanged, maritime issues left to later. A peace that recognizes exhaustion and the stalemate of distance. The year closes with the Great Lakes quiet under early ice, the Niagara emptying into a mist that smells of cold, and the Chesapeake's warships pacing outside capes that will soon see winter gales. In the Gulf of Mexico, sails gather at the horizon with their own errand. In New Orleans, earthen ramparts will rise out of marsh grass and cane. But that is another scene. For the moment, listen to the tone of a country that has endured fire and storm and is still working. Carpenters in Kingston plan one more keel just in case. Maryland farm boys tell each other how rockets sound when they fall short. Vermont teamsters lead oxen back from fords that held. and a printer in Baltimore sets type for a broadside poem whose meter matches a night of measured light. The war has found its limits by river, lake, and hill. The last movement will play out where tide meets river mud, and cotton bales become walls. The Gulf wakes under a lid of low cloud and the slow hiss of marsh grass. Far to the south, a British fleet draws together like weather. Transports, bomb vessels, tenders, sails patched and purposeful after the Chesapeake lessons. Army battalions that have chased Napoleon across Spain climb down into boats. Light infantry who know how to move. Highlanders who know how to hold. Sir Edward Pakenham, quick-eyed, disciplined, Wellington's brother-in-law, takes command ashore. Admiral Cochrane covers the water. Their brief is blunt. Seize a deep-water port at the mouth of the Mississippi. Crack the door to the continent and carry leverage to a peace table already set in Europe. Before the fleet can reach Louisiana, one more hinge turns on the southern rim. All year the interior had been a second war, the Creek War, where Andrew Jackson ground a confederacy to pieces at Horseshoe Bend in March 1814, and then in August wrote the Treaty of Fort Jackson across more than 20 million acres of Muskogee land, ally and enemy alike. Hard, controversial, final. For Washington, it cleared the flank. For Jackson, it brought promotion and a new command, the 7th Military District, and left him with militia, Choctaw allies, and a habit of moving first. When British Marines appear in Spanish Pensacola that autumn, arming Red Stick refugees and cooling their heels under a neutral flag, Jackson does not wait for a formal invitation. November 7th, he slams into the town, spikes the batteries, watches British tenders slide out to sea, and leaves a message cut deep. The Gulf Coast will not be a staging ground. The British choose the back door to New Orleans anyway, the shallow lakes and bayous east of the city. To open it, they row. December 14th, 1814, a flotilla of longboats swarms over Lake Bourne, oars thumping in rhythm, cutlasses and boarding pikes stacked under thwarts. Ahead lie 5 American gunboats under Lieutenant Thomas Ap Catesby Jones, braced in a crescent amid shoals. The fighting is close, wet and exhausting. Grappling hooks, pistol shots, splinters, the crush of bodies over low gunnels. Numbers tell. One by one, the gunboats strike. The lake is British. The water road to Bayou Bienvenue lies open. Jackson reads the water like a letter. He slides scouts into the reeds, leans on Lafitte's Baratarians for pilots and gun crews, and throws up earth where a drainage ditch cuts across the Chalmette plantations, the Rodriguez Canal, mud and logs, a face of dirt bristling with gun ports, anchored on the river and on cypress swamp. Behind it, he organizes a mosaic army, U.S. regulars, 7th and 44th Infantry in the center, Tennessee riflemen, and Kentucky militia fresh and half-armed. Free men of colour formed into battalions with crisp drill. Choctaw skirmishers probing the edges. Barataria gunners under Dominique U. and Beluche handling heavy pieces with a privateer's calm. General John Coffey holds the left among the trees. General William Carroll steadies the right. Daniel Patterson's naval guns watch the west bank. The enemy appears on a winter afternoon with the precision of a parade. December 23rd, British advance brigades under Keane step out of the scrub onto the Villers plantation, closer to the city than any American map had planned to allow. Jackson answers the only way he ever truly trusts: attack. That night he throws a rambling punch across the whole front. Regulars from the center, Coffey's men from the thickets, gunboats in the river adding their low thunder. In the dark, cane breaks and voices slip. Pistol flashes mark where lines actually are. By midnight, both sides pull back, sobered and awake. The British dig in. Jackson's spades fly at the canal. Days lengthen into a rhythm of testing and reply. December 25th, Pakenham arrives and finds a battlefield half-built and an opponent who will not gift him mistakes. December the 28th, British columns probe the line. Batteries answer from mud revetments with a bite that surprises veterans used to European fields. January 1st, 1815, Pakenham orders a grand artillery duel. Heavy guns dragged forward on rude carriages through wet ground, fascines laid, saps pushed. The American line lights at noon and argues with iron until dusk. Baratarian gunners earn their reputation. British batteries are mauled. The earthwork holds. Night brings rain and the slap of shovels. While the river country concentrates, the northeast endures a different pressure. In Maine, British columns have moved down the Penobscot and taken Castine, stamping New Ireland onto maps with a provisional government and a custom house that quietly rakes in duties all winter. Farther south, New England Federalists meet at Hartford, December to January, drafting constitutional amendments to fence federal power. Supermajority votes for war and embargoes, limits on long presidencies, the counting of representation. They prepare envoys to Washington, carrying grievances and proposals written in careful ink. The moments are concurrent and uneasy. One coast watching for oars at night, the other watching its own reflection in a long mirror. Back in the Delta, Pakenham chooses the straightest line. He will strike Jackson's East Bank wall head-on with 2 columns at dawn, while Colonel Thornton takes a picked force across the river in boats to roll up the American batteries on the west bank. When those guns are turned, they will rake Jackson's line from behind while the main body goes in. Simple, clean, dependent on timing, ladders, and luck. Dawn, January 8th. A low fog clings to the cane and the cypress knees. Breath smokes in the chill. On the British right, men of the 44th, assigned to carry fascines and ladders, miss the step off and come up late, their loads muddled. On the left, Gibbs's column dresses, ranks and moves into ground that narrows under fire. Pakenham rides the line, urging speed, waving his hat, signalling to close up. For a few minutes, the fog protects movement. Then it lifts like a dropped curtain. The canal's parapet erupts, long, measured volleys from the centre, buck and ball from the flanks, 12 and 24-pounders coughing grape and canister down lanes where the ground gives no cover. Men go down in clumps. Files step through them and go down in turn. Pakenham pushes forward under the Union flag, carries a brigade across the open, and is unhorsed by a case shot. He stands, rallies the line, and a moment later the blast of a howitzer tears him from the saddle for good. Gibbs is mortally hit, Keane badly wounded. Lambert, cautious and cool, takes command and tries to extract order from slaughter. On the far bank, Thornton's assault has actually worked. Boats slid past obstacles in the pre-dawn. A bayonet rush took Patterson's batteries, but the river current and the fog stole minutes, and minutes were the key. With the East Bank attack broken and senior officers down, Lambert pulls Thornton back, trading a foothold for an army that can still march. Silence after noon is louder than the morning's roar. The slope before the American line is a carpet of red and green. Surgeons work until their hands cramp. Jackson rides the line once, nodding as if to a plan completed, says little, and lets the men eat. In the days that follow, the British bombard Fort St. Philip downriver from January 9th to 18th, with bomb vessels at long range, shells climbing and falling in long parabolas. The fort's sand and brick soak the blows. The channel stays shut. Cochrane and Lambert hold a council, count shot, tally rations, and decide the arithmetic doesn't work. By the end of the month, the fleet is slipping back through bayous. It entered with such certainty 6 weeks before, towing empty longboats where trophies were meant to be. While cannon smoke still drifts over the Cane, parchment catches up with reality. In Ghent, on Christmas Eve, 1814, commissioners signed a treaty that did not settle a single maritime principle they argued over, and did not move a single boundary stone either. It restored what had existed before the war and left the future to the future. But by the time the words ride winter winds across the Atlantic, New Orleans has been fought and the story has outpaced the law. In Washington, dispatch riders pass couriers on the road, the tale of victory rushing east while the text of peace hurries west. The effect is alchemy. Hartford's envoys arrive to find bells ringing for Jackson. Their sober proposals, crafted in a winter of blockade and doubt, are drowned out by newsprint exulting a mud wall and an army of composites. In New England, embarrassment cools hot ideas. In the South and West, a general's name becomes a talisman. In British messes from Jamaica to Halifax, officers who had expected an easy river town shake their heads over a ledger they could not balance. Mud, ditches, timing, and a wall that would not fall for any price. Elsewhere, the lights go out quietly. On the lakes, shipwrights caulk one more seam and stack one more spar under a shed in case peace has tricks. Garrisons measure powder to the ounce and wait under grey skies that finally feel less armed. In Maine, customs receipts still clink into British strongboxes at Castine, while rumours of treaty ride in from Quebec over snow roads. In Baltimore, a printer resets a poem he first ran as a handbill into something more permanent. In Nashville and New Orleans, toasts lengthen and stories settle into shape. What remains in this chapter is the feel of that winter. Marsh fog at dawn and a flag climbing a staff over brick. The hollow thud of a rocket tube and the steadier heartbeat of a 24-pounder. An officer's pencil drawing rations into columns and coming up short. A general's boot heel pressed into wet clay at the lip of a ditch that turned an army. One last act waits. The signatures, the ratifications, the untangling of occupations from Maine to the Mississippi. And then the long exhale. But the hinge is here, a failed incursion at the nation's gate that rewrote memory faster than any statute could. Winter gives way, and with it the last hard edges of the war. Couriers ride in opposite directions along frozen roads, one bearing the news of New Orleans, the other carrying a folded treaty from a Flemish city. The packet from Europe reaches Washington first, a parchment sealed at Ghent on Christmas Eve, 1814. No conquests traded, no new lines drawn, both sides to put things back as they were. The Senate ratifies on February the 16th, 1815. Ratifications are exchanged the next day. Bells answer cannon. Blockade squadrons loosen their grip and stand off to sea. Sails crowd harbours that have spent 2 years counting creeks in the night. The war's momentum lingers a few beats longer than the law. On the Gulf Coast, British veterans, still closing their ledgers after New Orleans, take Fort Bowyer at Mobile on February 12th. Then learn 4 days later the fight is over and withdraw. In Maine, British customs men at Castine keep raking duties into strong boxes marked New Ireland until tidings of peace cross the snow roads. Then they go as quietly as they came. Everywhere, garrisons inventory shot and salt beef, stack muskets, and read orders twice to make sure they are real. Read the treaty closely, and you find its careful modesty. It restores captured places. Detroit returned months earlier by victory, Fort Niagara by article, and sets up mixed commissions to tidy boundary puzzles. It says the allies on both sides will be included in the peace and that prisoners will go home. It does not settle impressment. Napoleon's fall has already made that question moot. It does not redraw the continent. It simply stops the bleeding, and in stopping it, forces bigger changes to happen in quieter ways. Those changes arrive almost at once. The White House, charred shell along Pennsylvania Avenue, is lime-washed to a clean, almost defiant brightness. The capital's wings begin to rise again from blackened stone. New England's Hartford Convention delegates come to a capital ringing with news from the Mississippi and find their careful resolutions turning to ash in the air. The Federalist Party, brilliant in ledgers and brittle in optics, begins its long ebb. In Baltimore, a poem printed as a broadside becomes a song people hum in taverns, its meter borrowed from a British air, its vision from a night of red arcs over a star-shaped fort. In Nashville and New Orleans, toasts lengthen. A general's name becomes shorthand for nerve. On the lakes, the armies step back and the shipyards go quiet. Half-built hulls are roofed over for later that never comes. 2 years pass, and the countries do something remarkable. They agree to disarm the water that taught them both so much. The Rush-Bagot Agreement of 1817 limits each flag to a few small vessels on Erie, Ontario, and Champlain. The Great Lakes become, for a long generation, more market road than battlefield. A year later, the Convention of 1818 will draw a straight line between the United States and British North America along the 49th parallel to the Rockies and agree to share the far northwest for a time. The war ends with boundaries largely unchanged. Within 3 years, those boundaries are gentled where they matter most. At sea, the mood is different, quieter but certain. American heavy frigates, Constitution, United States, President, have proved an idea. Macdonough's kedges at Plattsburgh and Perry's transfer under fire have proved another. Confidence becomes policy. In 1815, Stephen Decatur and William Bainbridge take squadrons straight to the Barbary coast, smash corsair fleets, and sign treaties that read like punctuation. Tribute is over. The flag stands on its own. The republic that once hid its ships now leads with them. Across the border, the memory of the war sets like a foundation. Upper and Lower Canada did not fall, and the defense, militia and regulars together, Brock's Dash, de Salaberry's Abattis, Laura Secord's midnight walk, the stand at Chrysler's farm, becomes a story people tell about themselves. A national feeling, still colonial but more self-aware, carries forward through quiet decades. In British messes from Halifax to Jamaica, officers close notebooks with a pragmatic satisfaction. Canada was held. The Royal Navy remained what it was. The Empire can return its attention to Europe and India. The practice of riverine war and coastal raiding has been refined. The lesson about timing, learned painfully at Baltimore and New Orleans, is not forgotten. The cost that bites deepest falls on nations not sitting at Ghent's table. Tecumseh is gone. The confederacy he held together unravels into separate treaties and grim arithmetic. The British abandon the idea of a protected indigenous buffer on the old northwest frontier. American commissioners move through 1815 to 19 with pens and annuities, carving sessions at Prairie du Chien, Fort Jackson, Greenville revisited. The Treaty of Fort Jackson, signed months before Ghent, hangs longest. More than 20 million acres in the southeast changed hands. In a single day, the frontier rolls forward in furrows and cotton rows. The loss is measured in migrations and in names that vanish from maps. The army that went to war, small and uncertain, comes back a little different. Winfield Scott's grey-drilled brigades made a line at Chippewa and stood under hell at Lundy's Lane. His manuals become habit. The regular force shrinks, but West Point grows in stature. Ordnance and engineering, not just elan, become the grammar of the profession. The Navy, still small, keeps its best ships afloat as symbols as much as weapons. One, especially, Constitution, sails on as if to prove that the nickname Old Ironsides belonged to a country as much as to a hull. Economically, the blockade's pain has an odd aftertaste. Cut off from British manufactures, New England and Middle State mills learned to spin and weave on their own. When peace comes, they are not eager to yield the field. Congress will argue over tariffs and roads, rivers and canals, questions the war shoved into everyone's hands. The American system is an argument as much as a plan, but it is a plan people can picture. A republic stitched together by turnpikes and towpaths, so no general will again count barrels over mud and distance and lose. Go back once more, gently, to the human scale. A clerk in Kingston closes the last ledger for H.M.S. Saint Lawrence and leaves the yard smelling of wet oak and tallow. A boat builder at Presque Isle raises a child by candlelight and tells them, when asked, that once whole navies lay in their bay. On the Niagara, families rebuild from stone chimneys outward. In New Orleans, free men of color step off a parade ground with heads high, having heard a general thank them in public for steadiness under fire. In Washington, masons set new marble atop scorched foundations. Whitewash dries to a brightness people will stop explaining and just call a name. History will call the war a draw on paper, status quo antebellum. But paper does not hold pride or memory, or the way two neighbors learned what it takes to live beside one another with a long, quiet border. Paper does not hold the ache of nations caught between them. What does endure are the shapes the war left behind. A song that kept the night's beat over a harbor. A city that took a punch and learned how to brace. A line of water turned from battlefield to avenue. A habit on both sides of letting the lakes mirror sky instead of masts. So let it end softly. Canvas furled, cannon spiked or stored. Glory packed away into colors, trooped once a year. The lakes go flat under evening light. The Atlantic breathes without menace. The roads that carried war carry wool and wheat and court writs again. In the quiet, you can still find fragments, grape buried in orchard soil, a brass button in sand, a rotted stake where a battery once stood. Mostly, though, you will hear ordinary sounds. Hammers in shipyards making merchant hulls, bells over docks, the wheel of a canal lock, a quill scratching peace into routine. Breathe out. The War of 1812 closes where it should, not with a shout on a field, but with work, law, and memory. The map looks the same. The people on it do not.